The barn door groaned on its hinge, and Ira Keating came up out of sleep the way he always did after 10 years on the trail before the forge claimed him. Hand finding the shotgun leaned by his cot before his eyes had even opened all the way. Someone was moving among his tools. He heard the scrape of a crate being dragged, the soft grunt of effort, and beneath it, quieter, a voice trying to hush something that would not be hushed. He came through the tack room in his stocking feet, shotgun low but ready, and found not a horse thief crouched over his anvil, but a woman on her knees in the straw, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and blood on her hands that was not her own. "Don't you dare," she said, without even turning around before he had spoken a word. "Don't you dare shoot before you look at what you're shooting at." Ira looked. A young man lay stretched in the hay, gray-faced, one arm bound crudely with a strip of what had once been a petticoat, his trouser leg dark and stiff with dried blood at the thigh. The woman had her palm pressed flat against his side, steady as a surgeon, though her chin trembled with the effort of keeping her voice even. "He's been shot," she said. "Not by me. I found him on the Tascosa Road not 2 miles from town, thrown from his horse and bleeding into the caliche, and I was not about to leave him there for the buzzards while I went looking for a proper doctor who might or might not be sober. Your barn was closer than my own back lot, and I am sorry for the trespass, Mr. Keating, truly I am, but I needed a dry floor and a door that shut." Ira lowered the shotgun slowly. He recognized her now that the lamp caught her face, Effie Blackwell, from the Mercantile, the woman who kept old Pruett's ledgers straighter than any man in 3 counties, and who had once told a cattle buyer to his face that his scale was rigged and proven it with a second scale of her own. He had traded her iron nails for flour more times than he could count, and never once heard her raise her voice, until now. "You could have knocked," he said, mostly because he did not know what else to say with his heart still going like a drum. "At 2 in the morning. You'd have shot first and asked questions of my corpse." She looked up at him then, and even in the lamp's poor light he saw she meant it as a joke, though her eyes were wet and furious with fear for the boy beneath her hands. "Are you going to help me hold this wound closed, Mr. Keating, or are you going to stand there admiring your own shotgun?" He set the gun against the wall and knelt across from her in the straw. "Who is he?" "I don't know yet. He hasn't said 3 words that made sense. But somebody shot him, and shot at him more than once, because there's 2 furrows cut through the brush behind where I found him, close enough together to be the same rider circling back to finish the job." She pressed harder, and the young man groaned, eyelids fluttering. "I think whoever did it meant for him not to reach town at all." Ira looked down at the boy's face, young, maybe 20, sunburned raw across the nose the way a man got only from long weeks in open country, and felt the old cowhand instinct in him wake up alongside the blacksmith's steadier hands. "Bring the lamp closer," he said. "I've sewn worse than this shut on a trail with a whiskey bottle and a curved needle. Let's see what we're dealing with before we decide who to be afraid of." She did not argue, which he would come to learn was rare for her, and together they worked over the stranger by lamplight while the wind outside picked up along the eaves, restless and low, like something far off deciding whether or not to come closer. By the time gray light crept between the barn boards, the boy was breathing easier, his fever not yet risen, the wound in his thigh cleaned and packed and bound tighter than Ira's own doctoring alone would have managed. Effie sat back against a hay bale, her skirt ruined, her hands finally still. "You've done this before," Ira said. "I keep the pharmacy shelf at the Mercantile." A body learns things, stocking bandages and reading the manufacturer's pamphlets while she waits for customers who never come before 9. She glanced at him. "You've done this before too. That wasn't your first stitch. 8 years driving cattle up from the nooses to the railheads will teach a man to sew a friend shut when there's no doctor for 80 miles. He wiped his hands on a rag. "I hung up my rope for this forge 4 years back. Figured I'd had enough of sleeping under wagons. And yet here you are, patching a stranger up on your barn floor at dawn." Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. "Some habits don't shoo off so easy, Mr. Keating." "Call me Ira," he said. Seeing as we've now bled on each other's hands, seems foolish to stand on Mr. Effie then. She looked down at the sleeping stranger. And I suppose we ought to find out who nearly finished him off, and why, before whoever it was comes looking to finish the job properly. Outside, the wind gusted harder against the barn wall, rattling a loose shingle, and neither of them yet knew how much that same wind would matter before the season was through. The stranger woke fully near midday, and gave his name as Tom Riggins, rider for the Circle W outfit under Holly's Bramwell, up north along the Sorrel Creek Range. He was hoarse and pale and kept trying to sit up before Ira's hand on his shoulder pressed him back down. "Cattle," Tom said, as if the word alone explained everything. Dead cattle, dozens of them more, piled up along the creek bank after the big blow last week pushed the water up over the low ground. Blackleg got into the herd some time back, Mr. Bramwell figured, and the flood carried the carcasses right down into the creek before we could burn them proper. I was riding to warn the town, tell folks not to drink downstream of the Circle W range till it cleared, and 2 riders come up out of the breaks and started shooting before I'd said a word to either one. "Did you know them?" Effie asked, leaning forward. "One of them rode a big gray with a bar V mark I've seen hitched outside the land office in town. Wears his hat funny, brim rolled up sharp on the left. Goes by Mal, I think. Works for that landman Voss." Ira and Effie exchanged a look that neither of them had to explain to the other. Garrett Voss had been in Sorrel Creek only since spring, all silk waistcoats and railroad talk, buying up land options along the creek bottom with a smoothness that had made half the town hopeful and the other half uneasy. Why would a land agent's man shoot a cowhand for warning folks about tainted water? Ira asked. "That," Effie said slowly, "is exactly the sort of question I intend to find an answer to." She rose, brushing straw from her ruined skirt with the brisk, unbothered efficiency of a woman who had long ago stopped expecting her clothes to survive her work. "I need to get back before Cornelius wonders where I've spent the night, and before anyone remarks on my absence in a town where everyone remarks on everything. Can you keep him hidden here a few days, Ira? Just until we know more." "I can keep him fed and out of sight," Ira said. "What I can't promise is that nobody comes looking." "Then we'd best find out what there is to find quickly," she said, and there was steel enough in her voice that Ira believed, without quite knowing why yet, that she would. The Blackwell and Prout Mercantile sat at the heart of Sorrel Creek's one real street, its false front freshly whitewashed, its shelves stocked with everything from canned peaches to plow points, and its books, Effie knew better than anyone alive, kept in a hand far steadier than her guardian's own. Cornelius Prout looked up from behind the counter when she came in, his spectacles sliding down his nose, his mustache drooping the way it always did when he had spent a bad night with the Ledgers. "Where in the name of Providence have you been, Euphemia? I had Mrs. Calloway asking after you at church hour, and I had no earthly notion what to tell her." "I was tending to a matter of some urgency," Effie said, setting her bag behind the counter and reaching immediately for the invoice book, the habit of years overriding even a sleepless night. "You may tell Mrs. Calloway that I was seeing to charitable work, which is not a lie, and which ought to satisfy her curiosity better than the truth would." She flipped the ledger open and her eye caught, almost without her willing it, on a line 3 entries down. "Cornelius, this invoice from the Voss Freight Concern. 40 pounds of alum delivered the 14th, $4.60. What of it? We never received 40 pounds of alum. We received 20. I signed for it myself, and I recall distinctly because I had to tell the drayman we hadn't ordered near so little for the filtering barrels." She turned the ledger toward him. "Someone has billed us for twice what came off that wagon." Prout's mustache twitched, and he did not meet her eyes. "A clerical error, surely. I'll have a word with Voss's office." "You will let me have the word," Effie said, "since I am the one who does the arithmetic in this store, and I do not care for being billed twice for goods I never touched." She did not press further, not yet, though she noted the way her guardian's hands had gone still on the counter, the way he had not argued so much as deflected, and filed it away the same careful way she filed every discrepancy she had ever caught in 15 years of keeping his books straighter than he deserved. Outside, the wind gusted down the street hard enough to rattle the mercantile sign on its chains, and two trail hands crossing toward the saloon had to catch their hats. "Storm building somewhere out west," old Mr. Calloway said from the porch, squinting at a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise along the horizon. "Telegraph lines been humming and cracking all morning. Operator says there's weather moving down out of the panhandle proper, and it don't sound like the pleasant kind." Effie looked at that sky a long moment, thinking not of the storm at all, but of dead cattle rotting in a creek, and a bullet meant for a boy who'd only tried to warn his neighbors, and a man in a silk waistcoat who had somehow known enough to want him silenced. Garrett Voss came into the mercantile himself not an hour later, exactly as if her thoughts had summoned him, all polished boots and a smile too wide for the occasion. "Miss Blackwell, you look tired. I trust you're not overtaxing yourself with this establishment's books. A woman of your evident intelligence ought to have gentler burdens." "I manage my burdens well enough, Mr. Voss, gentle or otherwise." She did not look up from the ledger. "What can we do for you?" "A word with your guardian if he's about. Business." He leaned against the counter with an ease that assumed welcome. "Though while I'm here, I did want to say, Miss Blackwell, how it pleases me to see a woman handling figures with such confidence. It's rare. My own late mother could scarcely balance a household account." "Your late mother did not have Cornelius Prute's debts to untangle, I imagine," Effie said, and watched the smile falter just slightly before it recovered. "Was there a figure in particular you wished to discuss, or only my aptitude for them?" Voss laughed, a practiced sound. "Direct as ever. Very well. I understand this recent trouble with the creek water has folks unsettled. I've taken the liberty of arranging a hauling contract, clean water from a spring tank 2 days east, at a fair price, until the difficulty resolves itself. I only came to offer the mercantile first refusal, given our friendly association." "How generous," Effie said, "for a man who only arrived in Sorrel Creek in the spring to have already secured a spring tank 2 days east. A prudent man plans ahead of trouble, Miss Blackwell. It's how fortunes are kept." His eyes flicked toward the window, toward the edge of town where the smoke of Ira Keating's forge rose thin against the darkening sky. "Speaking of land, I hear the blacksmith holds a small parcel out along the creek bottom. An old spring on it, I'm told. Might you know if he'd consider selling? A man in his trade has little use for 40 scrubby acres. You would have to ask Mr. Keating that," Effie said evenly, though something cold moved through her at the question. "Though I expect he values that spring rather more than you imagine, Mr. Voss, scrubby or not." Voss's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did, calculating, filing her answer away much as she filed his invoices, and he took his leave with a bow that felt, to Effie, less like courtesy than a warning she had not yet learned to read. Ira spent that afternoon with his sleeves rolled and sweat cutting clean lines through the soot on his forearms, shoeing a big sorrel gelding for a trail outfit passing through on their way north, while half the town's business seemed to funnel past his open doors the way it always did before weather men wanting wagon tires checked, hinges mended, a broken plowshare welded before the wind could finish tearing loose whatever it had started on. He looked up once mid-strike and found Effie Blackwell standing just inside the doorway, watching him with an expression she did not bother to hide, the way a person watches something they have decided, quietly, is worth watching. "You're good at that," she said when he set the hoof down and straightened. "I've had practice." He wiped his brow with his forearm. "You didn't come here to admire my horseshoeing, Effie Blackwell." "No." She stepped further in, glancing toward the back room where presumably Tom Riggins still lay resting. "How is he?" "Fever's down. He ate this morning, which is more than I expected 2 days ago." Ira set his tongs aside. "Voss's man tried to kill him, Effie, not scare him off. Kill him. That's not the act of a land agent worried about competition." "I know." She told him then of the doubled invoice, of Voss's visit, of the question about his spring. Ira listened with his jaw set tighter with every sentence, and when she finished, he was quiet a moment before he spoke. "That spring's the best water within 10 miles of this town," he said. "Cold, clean, never once gone dry in the 4 years I've held that claim. If the creek's fouled with dead stock and the town wells no better, that spring's worth more than gold to whoever controls it. And Voss wants to control it." Effie crossed her arms. "Which means he needs the creek to stay bad, or seem worse than it is, long enough for him to buy up what he needs at a price folks will accept out of desperation. That's a hard thing to prove. Everything is hard to prove until someone proves it." She looked around his forge, the ordered rows of tools, the careful stacks of iron stock, the way even his chaos had a system to it, and something in her chest, which she had long ago decided had no room in it for foolishness, shifted anyway. "You keep this whole town running, don't you? Wheels, wells, hinges, harness. If your forge went cold a week, half of Sorrel Creek would grind to a stop." "I don't know as I'd put it so grand," Ira said, though the color that rose along his neck suggested he was not entirely unmoved by the observation. "It's not grand, it's arithmetic," Effie said. "I deal in arithmetic." "You are, arithmetically speaking, indispensable to this town, Ira Keating, and I intend to make use of that fact if you're willing." "Willing to do what? Help me find proof. You understand iron and tools better than any man in this county. If someone tampered with the town well, there'll be marks on it only a smith would know how to read. And I understand contracts and figures better than Voss gives me credit for. Between the two of us, I think we might just catch a liar in his own ledger." Ira looked at her a long moment, at the soot-streaked determination in her face, and felt something settle in him that had nothing to do with iron at all. "There's an old gate out front of your mercantile," he said, apropos of nothing she expected. "Hinges are rusted clean through. I noticed it last winter." "It isn't worth fixing," Effie said automatically, the practical answer coming before she'd even considered why he'd mentioned it. "It doesn't bring in a single extra customer, and the iron and my time would cost more than the gate's worth. I've priced it out. Better to let it hang crooked and spend the money on stock." "Practical," Ira said, something unreadable in his voice. "I am always practical," Effie said. "It's the only thing that's kept the store solvent since my father died and left me a guardian who couldn't balance a till if his life depended on it." "I believe you," Ira said, and did not say anything more about the gate, though he did not forget it either, filing it away in the same quiet part of himself where he kept the things worth remembering. The water crisis broke into open panic 3 days later, when 2 families on the low end of town woke to find their well-drawn water gray and foul-smelling, and half a dozen head of a passing trail herd, watered at the creek the evening before, dropped dead in their tracks before noon. Dr. Sims, the town's aging and increasingly unreliable physician, pronounced the creek temporarily unwholesome and recommended boiling, which did nothing for the animals and little to calm the growing crowd outside the mercantile. Garrett Voss appeared within the hour, as though he had been waiting just out of sight for the moment to arrive, and mounted the mercantile's porch steps to address the gathering crowd with the easy authority of a man who had rehearsed the speech. "Friends, I know this is a frightening morning, but I want you to know I've already arranged for clean water to be hauled in from a spring source 2 days' ride east, at a price no higher than fairness demands, until such time as the creek runs clear again. No one in Sorrel Creek need go thirsty while I have breath in my body." A murmur of relief moved through the crowd, and Effie, standing at the edge of the porch with her arms crossed, felt her stomach turn at how easily gratitude could be bought with a problem a man had likely helped create. 2 days east is a long way to haul water for a whole town," she said, loud enough to carry. "How many wagons do you have running that route, Mr. Voss, and how long before the price you're calling fair climbs to something less so?" The crowd's attention swung toward her, and Voss's smile thinned by a fraction. "I understand emotions run high, Miss Blackwell, but this is hardly the moment for arithmetic," she said. It is precisely the moment for arithmetic, since arithmetic is what will tell this town whether it's being rescued or robbed. She's just a shopkeeper fretting over her figures. Someone in the crowd muttered, not unkindly, but dismissive all the same. And Effie felt the old, familiar sting of being seen as decoration to a business she alone had kept from ruin. Even as Sheriff Dade Larkin, overworked and out of his depth, urged the crowd to disperse and let cooler heads sort things through. She caught Ira's eye across the street, where he stood in his forge doorway, soot-streaked and silent, and something passed between them that needed no words. Cooler heads would sort things through, indeed, and they had every intention of being those heads. That evening, by lantern light at the town's old backup well dug decades before, and rarely used since the creek had proven reliable, Ira knelt at the pump housing with a rag and a bent nail, running his fingers along the iron collar where the pump rod met the casing. "Someone's had a wrench on this," he said. "See here, these scratches, fresh, not rust-worn. Whoever did it forced the cap loose, poured something down the shaft, and didn't bother being careful putting it back." Effie crouched beside him, holding the lantern steady. "Poured what?" "I don't know for certain, but it isn't rot from dead cattle. That's the creek's trouble. This is something else." He straightened, turning the bent nail over in his fingers where he'd used it to probe the residue-crusted pail along the pump's throat. "White crust like this I've seen before on a trail drive years back. A man salted a rival outfit's water hole with something out of a rat poison tin to run them off good grazing. Looked just like this once it dried." "Arsenic," Effie breathed. "Someone poisoned the backup well on purpose, so the creek being fouled by the flood wasn't enough. They wanted every source in town undrinkable except what Voss controls." She sat back on her heels, fury and clarity moving through her in equal measure. "I've seen an invoice for sheep dip in Voss's freight manifest. 40 pounds of it delivered the same week the storm hit, though nobody in this county runs sheep within 30 miles. I thought it an odd order. I didn't think it a weapon." "It's a start," Ira said, "but a start isn't proof a judge would hang a case on." "No," Effie agreed, "but it's proof enough to be dangerous to Voss if the wrong people hear it, which means we'd best be careful who does." They were not careful enough, or perhaps no amount of care would have mattered, because 2 nights later, as the wind rose steadily out of the northwest, and the sky over Sorrel Creek took on the color of an old bruise, 2 riders came quiet through the dark to Ira's barn, and Effie, who had taken to sitting up some evenings while Tom Riggins mended, heard the horses before she saw them. Get up now," she whispered, shaking Tom's shoulder where he lay half asleep in the hay loft, his leg still splinted, his strength only partly returned. "Someone's coming." The barn door swung open, and a big man with his hat brim rolled sharp on the left stepped through, a second man behind him with a shotgun cradled loose across his arm. "Evening," the first man said, and Effie recognized the description Tom had given Deke Malley, Voss's foreman, his voice pleasant in a way that made her skin crawl. "We heard tell there might be an injured party sheltering hereabouts. Mr. Voss is concerned for the fellow's welfare. Wants him seen by a proper doctor in comfort, not left to rot in a blacksmith's barn." "He's being tended just fine," Effie said, stepping between Malley and the loft ladder, her heart hammering though her voice stayed level. "You may tell Mr. Voss's concern is noted and unnecessary." "Wasn't asking your leave, ma'am." Malley's eyes flicked past her toward the loft. "Boy's got no business being in the middle of grown men's affairs. Best he comes along quiet." "He comes along over my dead body," Effie said, and meant it so plainly that even Mal paused. It was Ira's voice from the barn door that broke the standoff, low and even, the shotgun in his hands not raised but not lowered either. "Way I understand Texas law, Mal, a man can't be dragged off another man's property against his will, injured or not, without that man's consent or a lawful writ. You got a writ. Don't need one to do a neighbor a kindness." Funny kindness coming with a shotgun. Ira stepped further into the lamplight. I've already written the particulars of this boy's shooting to the land office in Tascosa, along with a description of the horse that did it, a gray with a Bar V brand, ridden by a man wearing his hat rolled sharp on the left. Hurting him now, or dragging him off, only makes that letter read a good deal worse for whoever sent you. It was, Effie would realize only later, an outright bluff. The letter did not yet exist, but Ira delivered it with such flat, unhurried certainty that Mally's partner shifted his weight, uneasy and Mally himself. After a long moment weighing the shotgun and the two of them, and the storm building outside that would soon make any quick escape harder than it looked, spat once into the straw and turned for the door. "Tell Voss he ought to be more careful whose barns he sends men into at night," Ira called after him. "Some of us shoot first and ask questions of the corpse." It was, Effie realized afterward with a laugh she couldn't quite suppress despite her pounding heart, her own joke thrown back at her, and when the hoofbeats had faded into the wind, she found herself laughing harder than the moment probably warranted, some of it fear finding its way out any door it could. "You are entirely too calm for a man who just bluffed two armed strangers off his own property," she said. "Wasn't calm, was terrified, just didn't see the use in showing it." Ira set the shotgun down and his hands, she noticed, were shaking now that the danger had passed. "We need to write that letter for real first thing, before he decides to call the bluff." "We will," Effie said. "Tomorrow, tonight, I think we've all earned a moment to simply breathe." She did not tell him, not then, how much steadier she'd felt standing beside him in that lamplight than she had felt standing alone in front of a whole crowd on the mercantile porch. Some arithmetic did not need saying aloud to be understood. Cornelius Prute's confession, when it finally came not from courage but from exhaustion, 2 days after the confrontation in the barn, when Effie found him sitting alone in the mercantile's back office after closing, a bottle of patent tonic and an unopened letter both untouched on the desk before him. "I owe Voss's syndicate $1,100, he said without preamble when she asked what troubled him. "Borrowed against next season's freight receipts to buy 2 more wagons, thinking the railroad talk meant business would double. It was a fool's bargain, Effie. The interest alone will ruin us before autumn. And Voss has offered to forgive it," Effie said slowly, "in exchange for something." Prute would not meet her eyes. "He suggested, merely suggested, mind you, that an alliance between our families might ease matters considerably. That your father's will releases my trusteeship of your share the moment you marry, and that if you were to marry a man of Voss's standing, the debt might simply disappear." The words landed like a physical blow, though Effie had half expected something of the sort since Voss's visit to the mercantile. "You would sell my hand to clear your debts, Cornelius." "I would never phrase it so coarsely. There is no other way to phrase it and have it mean what it means." She stood, her chair scraping back hard against the floor. "My father's will was meant to protect me, not deliver me to the highest bidder like a parcel of land. I've run half of this store's business myself since I was 17 years old, kept books straighter than any man Voss employs, and the law still sees fit to hand my own inheritance to whichever man I marry, as though I were incapable of holding it myself. It is an insult dressed up as protection, and I have swallowed it quietly for years because fighting it seemed a waste of energy better spent keeping this store alive. I will not swallow it now, not to save you from your own foolish borrowing, and certainly not to hand myself to Garrett Voss like a settled account." "Effie, no." She was already reaching for her shawl. "You will tell Voss I have refused, and you will tell him plainly, and if he threatens the debt further, we will find another way to answer it that does not involve my marriage to anyone." She left him sitting in the lamplight, the untouched tonic and the unopened letter still before him, and walked out into a night that had gone strangely still, the wind that had troubled the telegraph wires for days holding its breath, as though gathering itself for something larger. She found Ira at the forge, banking the fire for the night, and told him everything, the debt, the will's clause, Voss's proposal delivered second-hand through a guilty old man too weak to refuse on his own. Ira listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he set down his tongs and looked at her steadily. "There's another way to end Prout's trusteeship," he said. "Doesn't have to be Voss you marry. Your father's will says marriage ends it, not marriage to any particular man. I'm aware of the technicality, Ira. I'm not talking about a technicality lightly." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncertain, choosing words the way a man chooses footing on unfamiliar ground. "I'm offering to marry you myself. In name only, if that's what you want. No claim on your share of the store, no claim on anything. I'd sign whatever paper makes that plain before witnesses. It would free you from Prout's control, put Voss's leverage to nothing, and give you standing to fight him in a courtroom as your own woman, not somebody's ward waiting on a man's permission to be believed." Effie stared at him, the offer settling into her like something too large for the space it had been given. "You would marry me, as a legal maneuver." "I would marry you," Ira said, "so that no man living could ever again treat your say in your own life as a bargaining chip. Whatever else it is or isn't, that part of it I mean plainly." She was quiet a long moment, and because she was, before anything else, a practical woman, she made herself consider it the way she considered any contract. What it cost, what it bought, what obligations it created and released. "It would work," she said slowly. "It would work cleanly. And I find, Ira Keating, that I do not want it to be clean." "Neither do I," he admitted low. "Which is why I'm fool enough to be standing here offering it anyway and hoping you'll tell me there's a better reason to marry you than paperwork." "There may be," Effie said, "but I won't have us discover it standing under the threat of Garrett Voss, with a debt and a deadline forcing our hand. If we marry, Ira, I want it to be because we chose it free and clear, not because it was the only convenient door left open to us. I refuse the convenience of it. I will find another way to break Prout's trusteeship, or I will simply endure it a while longer and fight Voss regardless. But I will not marry you as a maneuver, not when some part of me already suspects I might want to marry you for entirely different reasons." Ira's breath went out of him slow, something like relief and something like disappointment both moving through his face at once. "Fair enough," he said. "We'll find the other way. And whatever's between us besides, we'll let it grow at its own pace and see what it decides to become, without a debt collector's clock ticking over it." "Agreed," Effie said, and held out her hand the way she might to seal any bargain, though the warmth that moved up her arm when he took it felt like nothing so ordinary as business at all. The wind that had held its breath broke loose 2 nights later, and broke loose hard. It came down off the high plains with a sound like the whole sky tearing, and within an hour every loose shingle, every unlatched shutter, every hastily strung telegraph wire in Sorrel Creek was fighting for its life. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. Dust and grit scoured the main street sideways, thick enough that lanterns showed only as smudges of orange in the churning dark, and somewhere out on the open range beyond the last houses, a trail crew's herd bedded down for the night, unlucky enough to be passing through when the storm hit, broke, and ran before the wind, thundering blind toward the edge of town. Sheriff Larkin's shouted warnings were barely audible over the roar. Effie, at the mercantile, was already moving before anyone told her to, hauling the last crates of dry goods up onto the counters away from the water already sheeting under the door, sending the Calloway children next door into the store's stone-walled root cellar, directing 2 trail hands sheltering on the porch to help brace the front window with boards nailed crosswise before the glass gave. Ira was 3 streets over, fighting his own battle. The forge roof had a section already peeling back like a scab, and beyond it, past the last fence line, he could hear the low thunder of hooves growing louder, cattle running scared and blind straight toward the huddle of tents where a second trail crew, caught unprepared, had made camp for the night. He swung up onto the sorrel he'd shod only days before, borrowed without asking because there was no time to ask, and rode hard into the wind and dark toward the sound of the stampede, shouting, waving his slicker, turning the lead steers with nothing but nerve and noise until the herd broke wide around the tent camp instead of through it, thundering off harmlessly into open pasture while men scrambled clear with seconds to spare. By the time he turned back toward town, soaked through and shaking with the aftermath of it, he saw the low bridge at the creek crossing, the only way in or out on the mercantile side of the wash, already beginning to give at one end, the water risen fast and ugly beneath it, and caught in the middle of it, half-dipped where a wheel had dropped into a rut the flood had opened, Effie's own delivery wagon. She was there already, he saw as he rode closer, soaked to the skin, hauling at the wagon's brake with both hands, trying to keep it from rolling the rest of the way off the failing bridge edge. "Get clear," he shouted, swinging down before the horse had fully stopped. "Effie, get clear, the whole span's going." "Not until I get the satchel," she shouted back, wind tearing the words half apart. "It's got everything, the invoices, the water sample, Prout's loan papers, all of it. If we lose that, we lose the only proof we have." Ira swore and vaulted up onto the wagon bed beside her, timbers groaning under them both. The satchel was wedged beneath the seat. He wrenched it free in one motion and shoved it into her arms. But his eyes caught in the same instant the small clay pot lashed to the wagon's side rail with twine, a rosebush, wind-whipped and battered, its few remaining blooms scattered already into the dark, the one thing on that wagon that carried no weight of evidence at all. "That too," he said, and reached for it. "Leave it, Ira, it's nothing, it's just a plant. It's your mother's," he said, already working the twine loose with fingers gone half-numb from cold. "You told me once. Only thing of hers you've got left besides a photograph. Paper can be copied, testimony can be sworn twice. That can't." The bridge shuddered beneath them, the far end dropping another foot into the rushing water with a crack like a rifle shot, and Effie screamed his name as he lost his footing for a heartbeat, catching himself hard against the wagon rail, the pot clutched against his chest, a gash opening along his forearm where the splintering wood caught him. Then they were both scrambling off the collapsing span, half falling, half thrown onto solid ground as the bridge gave way entirely behind them and dropped into the roaring water with a sound that seemed to shake the whole night. They lay a moment in the mud, soaked, breathless, the satchel of evidence clutched in Effie's arms and the battered rosebush cradled absurdly, gently, against Ira's chest, blood running warm down his forearm where the wood had cut him. "You are the most impractical man I have ever met," Effie said, half laughing, half sobbing with the release of fear, risking your arm for a half-dead rosebush when there were papers worth saving right beside it. "Ledger's replaceable," Ira said, wincing as he sat up. "Figures can be added up twice. That Rose is your mother, and I figured you'd rather have her back safe than a stack of numbers, Ledger woman." Effie stared at him, rain streaming down both their faces, and something in her chest that had been guarded and careful and practical for as long as she could remember simply gave way, the same as the bridge had, all at once and past any hope of holding. "You impractical, impossible cowboy," she said, and kissed him, hard and sudden, right there in the mud with the storm still screaming overhead. And Ira Keating, who had faced down armed men and stampeding cattle that same night without so much as a stumble, forgot entirely how to breathe. They did not have long to linger in it. The storm demanded every hand in town before dawn, but neither of them forgot, in all the exhausted, roaring hours that followed, the particular shape of that moment. A bridge gone, a rosebush saved, and something between them finally, unmistakably, out in the open where it could not be argued back into practicality again. The storm blew itself out just before sunrise, leaving Sorrel Creek looking like something had taken it by the collar and shaken it. Roof stood shingle bare in patches. The telegraph line lay in 3 broken pieces along half a mile of poles. The bridge was gone entirely, and 2 of the tent camps on the edge of town were simply gone as well, canvas and poles scattered halfway to the county line. But no one had died, which everyone agreed in the gray light of the morning after was closer to a miracle than the town deserved. And Ira Keating found himself, within an hour of first light, the busiest man in 3 counties. He set roof braces with iron brackets forged fresh at his own anvil while the coals were still catching. He straightened a bent wagon axle for the trail outfit that had nearly lost their herd, refusing payment when the trail boss offered it, saying only that the crew's quick thinking with the herd had saved his own forge roof from worse. He climbed a telegraph pole himself, boots braced against the crossarm, splicing wire back together with pliers borrowed off his own bench, because the lineman from the county seat was 2 days off yet, and Sorrel Creek could not wait 2 days to know whether the rest of the world had heard about them at all. Effie watched him from below, holding the wire steady as he worked, and thought, not for the first time, but with a clarity that startled her, that she had never in her life seen a man's competence look quite so much like tenderness. "You didn't have to fix the widow Hartley's roof for nothing this morning," she said, when he came down at last, his hands raw from the wire. "Widow Hartley's got 6 children and a husband 3 years in the ground. Seemed a poor time to hand her a bill." He wiped his palms on his trousers. "This town runs on iron and goodwill in about equal measure, Effie. Always has. I aim to keep it running, storm or no storm." "That," she said, "is precisely why I intend to see you paid properly for every hour of this, whether you argue or not, because a town that runs on a blacksmith's goodwill alone will bleed that blacksmith dry inside a year, and I won't have it." "There's the ledger woman I know," Ira said, and something in his smile made the exhaustion in her bones feel, briefly, entirely worth it. By mid-morning, the telegraph line held long enough to send and receive, and the message Effie composed and sent to the railroad's district office in Fort Worth, asking plainly whether a Garrett Voss held any authorized standing to negotiate land options on the company's behalf along Sorrel Creek, went out into the wire with her own hand on the key, since the regular operator had a broken wrist from a falling shutter. The reply came back 4 hours later, terse and unambiguous. No person by that name held any authority whatsoever to act for the Fort Worth and Denver City Railway, and the company would appreciate being informed of any individual falsely claiming otherwise. "He's a fraud," Effie said, staring at the strip of paper as though it might rearrange itself into something less satisfying. "Not merely a hard bargainer or a man ahead of his time, an outright fraud, selling options on land he has no authority to buy for a railroad that's never heard his name." "That's the last piece," Ira said, reading over her shoulder. "Tom's shooting, the poisoned well, the doubled invoices, and now this. We have enough to bury him if we bring it to the right ears." "The right ears aren't in Sorrel Creek," Effie said. "Sheriff Larkin's a good man but no match for a scheme this tangled, and Voss has half this town believing him a savior. We need the county judge in Tascosa, a proper courtroom, and every piece of proof laid out where it can't be argued away." "Tascosa's a day's ride, more with the bridge out," Ira said. "We'll need to ford the creek at the shallows above the old mill, and we'll need Tom well enough to travel, and Bramwell willing to speak on the cattle, and your uncle willing to hand over whatever papers prove the loan was crooked from the start." "Then we had best get started," Effie said, already folding the telegraph slip into her satchel beside the rest, "because I do not intend to give Garrett Voss 1 single day more to cover his tracks than we absolutely must." Cornelius Prout, when Effie found him that afternoon, looked 10 years older than he had a week before, but when she laid out what they knew, the fraud, the poisoning, the false authority, something in his slumped shoulders straightened, as though a weight he had been quietly drowning under had finally been named where he could fight it. "He told me the loan was standard railroad syndicate practice," Prout said, pulling the papers from his strongbox with hands that shook only slightly. 11% monthly, compounding, which I now realize is closer to robbery than finance. If he has no authority to act for any real company, then the loan itself was made under false pretense, and no court in Texas would hold me to its terms. No court in Texas, Effie agreed, provided we can prove the fraud plainly enough that even a judge inclined to be generous with a well-dressed man in a silk waistcoat cannot look away from it. I'll come to Tascosa, Prout said. I'll bring every paper he ever had me sign, and I'll tell the judge exactly how he dangled forgiveness of my debt in exchange for your hand, if that's what it takes to see him answer for it. I have been a poor guardian to you, Effie, weak where I ought to have been steady, and I am sorry for it more than I know how to say, but I will not be weak in this. Effie looked at him a long moment, old resentment and old affection both moving through her at once, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed him. They rode for Tascosa at first light 2 days later. Effie, Ira, Tom Riggins mounted carefully on a borrowed horse with his splinted leg braced in a modified stirrup Ira had forged specially the night before, Cornelius Prout with his strongbox of papers, and Holly's Bramwell, sent for from the Circle W range, riding alongside them with the grim, sun-weathered patience of a man who had lost 40 head of cattle and wanted very much to see someone answer for it. They forded Sorrel Creek at the shallows above the old mill, the water still running high and brown from the storm, and rode the long day across open range toward the county seat, the panhandle sky enormous and scoured clean overhead, as though the storm had never happened at all except in the wreckage they'd left behind them. They said little on the ride, most of it practical logistics, order of witnesses, what papers to present first. But once, when the trail narrowed and their horses fell in close together, Ira reached over and covered Effie's gloved hand with his own on the pommel, and she did not pull away, and neither of them needed to say anything more than that. Tascosa in the late spring of 1883 was a rough, sprawling cattle trail town along the Canadian River. Its courthouse, a low adobe and frame building that served the whole vast sweep of Oldham County, and it was crowded that particular afternoon with more business than usual cattle disputes, land filings, the ordinary churn of a county still finding its shape. Judge Ambrose Teal, a lean, dry-voiced man with a reputation for having no patience for nonsense from any direction, agreed to hear the matter the following morning, once he understood the scope of what was being alleged. Garrett Voss arrived in Tascosa himself that evening, summoned by a rider Sheriff Larkin had sent ahead, and made a show of outrage and cooperation both, declaring himself eager to clear his name of what he called malicious and ill-informed accusations from a disgruntled shopkeeper and her blacksmith paramour. "He knows," Effie said quietly, watching him from across the crowded street outside the boarding house where they'd taken rooms. "He knows exactly what we have, or near enough, and he's decided his best chance is to arrive first and shape the story before we can tell it. Then we'd best make certain our story doesn't need shaping," Ira said. "It only needs telling straight." The courthouse was full past its benches the next morning, word having traveled fast through a town that thrived on exactly this sort of drama, and Judge Teal called the matter to order with a rap of his gavel that silenced the room more through reputation than volume. Effie spoke first, laying out the doubled invoices, the arsenic-tainted sheep dip manifest, the pump housing's tool marks that Ira had cast in wax and brought as physical evidence, holding the room's attention with the same crisp, unhurried clarity she used to settle a disputed account, refusing to let Voss's occasional interjections rattle her rhythm. "The defense would have this court believe," Voss said, rising when his turn came, smooth and confident even now, "that a series of unfortunate coincidences, a flood, a disease outbreak among cattle, an unrelated theft of sheep dip from my freight stores, have been strung together by a young woman with an evident personal grudge and a blacksmith with, shall we say, a personal interest in her good opinion." A ripple of laughter moved through part of the room, and Effie felt her face heat, though she did not look away from the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "whether Mr. Keating has a personal interest in my good opinion is not, I think, relevant to whether Mr. Voss poisoned this town's water supply and shot an innocent cowhand to keep him quiet about it. I would ask that the court's attention stay fixed on the arithmetic and not the gossip." "Fair enough, Miss Blackwell," Judge Teal said, the faintest dry amusement in his voice. "Proceed." It was Tom Riggins's testimony that turned the room's mood, his voice still weak but steady, describing the two riders, the gray horse with the Bar V brand, the hat rolled sharp on the left, and the moment the bullet had knocked him from his saddle before he'd said a single word to either man. Hollis Bramwell followed, laying out with a rancher's blunt precision the timeline of his herd's sickness, the flood that had carried the dead into the creek, and his absolute certainty that no natural cause explained the second, separate fouling of the town's backup well. Then Dr. Wallace Nye, a druggist and sometime chemist summoned from Tascosa's own small pharmacy, testified to the water sample Effie had bottled and carried the entire journey wrapped in cloth against her saddle, arsenic, unmistakably, at a concentration no flood or dying cattle could account for, chemically distinct from the organic contamination in the creek itself. Two separate poisonings, Dr. Nye said. One accidental, born of the storm and the disease among the cattle. The other deliberate and recent, matching the residue found on the well's pump housing that Mr. Keating has presented to the court. Cornelius Prout rose next, his voice unsteady but his resolve plain, laying his lone papers before the judge and describing, without flinching, the debt, the compounding interest, and Voss's suggestion that it might disappear in exchange for his ward's hand in marriage. And then Effie produced the telegraph reply from the Fort Worth and Denver City Railway, and read it aloud into a courtroom gone entirely silent, and watched Garrett Voss's carefully composed face finally, unmistakably, crack. "This is outrageous," Voss said, half rising. "A single telegram, easily forged, from a company I have every legitimate—" "Mr. Voss," Judge Teal said, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had heard 1,000 liars and knew precisely how one sounded. "Sheriff Larkin here informs me he took the liberty, upon your arrival in Tascosa last evening, of searching the saddlebags of a Mr. Deke Malloy, currently held in the county jail on suspicion of the shooting of Mr. Riggins. Among Mr. Malloy's effects was a wrench whose jaw pattern, this court has been shown, matches precisely the tool marks found on the tampered well housing in Sorrel Creek. I find myself disinclined to believe that quite so many coincidences have conspired against you by accident." The room broke into murmurs, and Voss, seeing the tide turn entirely against him, made one final, desperate reach for composure. Even if some irregularities exist in how my agent conducted himself, that hardly proves I authorized. Mr. Voss," Effie said, cutting through the room's noise with the same clear voice she'd used to expose false weights on a cattle buyer's scale a year before. "You offered to forgive an $1,100 debt in exchange for my hand in marriage. On the same week your foreman poisoned the very water source that made your hauling contract so suddenly necessary. A man does not need to load the gun himself to be guilty of the shooting, when he is the only one who profits from the wound." Judge Teal's gavel came down, with a finality that seemed to settle over the entire room like the last quiet after a long storm. "I find the charges against Garrett Voss, including fraudulent representation of the Fort Worth and Denver City Railway, criminal poisoning of a public water source, and conspiracy in the assault of Thomas Riggins, sufficiently supported to bind him over for trial before the district court. Sheriff, take him into custody. All land option contracts entered under his false authority are void as of this ruling. And Mr. Prout, given the fraudulent nature of the loan's origination, I see no lawful basis for its collection. Consider the debt struck from any court's willingness to enforce it." The room erupted into noise, Hollis Bramwell's grim satisfaction, Prout's shuddering relief, and somewhere in the middle of it, Effie found Ira's hand finding hers again, steady as it had been on the trail, and did not let go. Sheriff Larkin's deputies led Voss out through the crowd, his composure entirely gone now, sputtering protests that no one troubled themselves to listen to. And Deke Malley, already in custody, would follow him to face his own reckoning for the shooting on the Tascosa Road. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the bright, scoured, storm-washed sunlight, Effie let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a week. "It's over," she said, half disbelieving. "The dangerous part is," Ira agreed. "The rest of it, the water, the town, what's left to rebuild, that'll take longer than an afternoon in a courtroom." "I know." She looked at him, at the bandage still wrapped around his forearm where the bridge had cut him, at the soot he hadn't quite managed to scrub from beneath his nails even for a court appearance, and felt something in her chest settle into a certainty she no longer had any interest in arguing herself out of. "But we'll manage it. We've managed harder things this past fortnight than I'd have thought possible a month ago." "We have," Ira said, "though I notice you keep saying we, Ledger Woman, and I find I don't mind it one bit." The ride back to Sorrel Creek took the better part of 2 days, the group parting ways at the Circle W turnoff with Holly's Bramwell's gruff thanks, and Tom Riggins's promise to come by the forge, once his leg had properly healed. And by the time Effie and Ira and Cornelius Prout crossed back over the rebuilt ford above the old mill, word of the courthouse ruling had already outrun them, carried by a rider Sheriff Larkin had sent ahead. And the whole town seemed to have gathered along the main street to meet them. There was a lightness in Sorrel Creek that evening that Effie had not felt since before the storm, perhaps not since her father had died. If she was honest with herself, some old low hum of worry finally allowed to go quiet. The town's spring, Ira's spring, was already being surveyed by a committee of 3 neighbors and one increasingly humbled Cornelius Prout, working out a fair arrangement by which the whole town might draw from it while the creek recovered, an arrangement Effie herself helped draft, careful and equitable in the way only a woman who understood contracts down to their smallest clause could make it. Prout found her alone that evening, sorting through the mercantile's storm-damaged stock by lamplight, and set a folded paper on the counter before her without a word. "What's this?" "Your father's trusteeship dissolved," he said. "I've had the county clerk draw it up properly, effective immediately, regardless of marriage, regardless of anything else. I should have fought to have it written that way from the start, when your father first drew up his will, instead of letting his fear for your welfare become a cage instead of a shelter. I cannot undo the years it cost you, Effie, but I can at least stop being one more weight on the scale against you." Effie stared at the paper a long moment, then reached across the counter and took her guardian's hand, the closest thing to a father she had left in the world, however imperfect. "Thank you," she said simply, and found she meant it entirely. She found Ira an hour later at the mercantile's front gate, the same rusted, crooked gate she had once told him, with such practical certainty, was not worth the cost of fixing, and stopped short in the lantern light of the porch, because the gate was no longer rusted or crooked at all. New iron ran along its top rail, worked into slow, careful curls of vine, and among the vines, unmistakable even in lamplight, a scattering of iron roses, each petal hammered thin and delicate as something that had never touched a forge fire in its life, though every one of them had. "Ira," she breathed. "When did you, evenings mostly after the storm work was done, when you thought I was banking the fire and going home?" He stood at the gate's far side, soot still on his hands from finishing the last hinge that very afternoon. "You said it wasn't practical to fix, said the arithmetic didn't favor it. You were right, probably. There's no profit in it at all." "Then why?" "Because I wanted to see your face when you came home to a gate that didn't creak," he said. "Because some things are worth doing even when the ledger says otherwise. Because I love you, Effie Blackwell, and I have known it since the night I found you kneeling in my barn with blood on your hands and fire in your voice, and I did not want to say it plainly until I'd shown you I meant it with something more than words." Effie stood very still, her hand resting on the gate's new latch, feeling the smoothness where he'd worked the metal until it moved without a sound. "You impractical, impossible cowboy," she said again, the same words as the storm-soaked night on the ruined bridge, though her voice broke gently around them this time instead of laughing. "I have spent my whole life being careful, weighing costs, refusing anything that didn't earn its keep, and you have gone and built me the most impractical, most beautiful thing I have ever owned, purely because it made me happy, and I find I don't want to be careful about this one particular thing at all." "Then don't be," Ira said, closing the distance between them at the gate. "Marry me, Effie, not for paperwork. Not to spite Voss or free you from anyone's foolish claws. That's already done. Your uncle saw to it himself. Marry me because I would rather stand beside you at a forge or a ledger or a courthouse or a rebuilt bridge for the rest of my life than anywhere else on this earth without you." "Yes," Effie said, before he had even finished the sentence, laughing through the sudden thickness in her throat. "Yes, Ira Keating, though I warn you now, I intend to keep the Mercantile's books exactly as strict after we're married as I did before, and I will expect you to charge Widow Hartley's roof repairs to somebody, even if it's me." "I would not have you any other way," Ira said, and kissed her there at the gate, beneath the iron roses he had made her, while the lanterns of Sorrel Creek burned steady against a sky finally, fully cleared of storm. They married 3 weeks later, in a ceremony neither elaborate nor small, in the Mercantile's own front yard beneath that same gate, with Holly's Bramwell standing witness alongside a fully recovered Tom Riggins, and Cornelius Prout giving the bride away with tears he did not bother hiding, and half of Sorrel Creek crowded onto the boardwalk to see the town's blacksmith and its sharpest merchant bound together at last. The forge and the Mercantile stood only a few streets apart, as they always had, and in the seasons that followed, townsfolk grew accustomed to seeing Effie Keating cross between the two several times a day, ledger under one arm, negotiating prices as shrewdly as ever, while her husband's hammer rang steady in the background like a second heartbeat for the whole town to keep time by. The spring on Ira's old homestead parcel ran clean and cold through every season after, shared fair and equal under the contract Effie herself had drafted, and no one in Sorrel Creek ever again went thirsty for want of an honest source. Voss's trial in the district court ended in time, with a conviction that kept him well away from panhandle land dealings for the better part of 2 decades, and Deke Mao found himself similarly occupied at the state's expense. And the gate at the front of the Mercantile, impractical, unprofitable, utterly unnecessary by any arithmetic Effie had ever trusted before, swung open smooth and silent every single day, its iron roses catching the morning light, a small and permanent proof that not every worthwhile thing in a person's life needed to earn its keep to be worth keeping, and that sometimes the most impractical gesture a careful heart ever received was exactly the one it had been waiting for all along.